You'll be asking yourselves, as scientists of yourselves, why would it be that certain patterns of exercise would lead to more or less fat loss? I mean, it can't just be about the energy burned. We already established that. And again, it has to do with the neurons. It has to do with how we engage the nervous system. So while non-exercise activity-induced thermogenesis, NEAT, the fidgeting, and cold can induce thermogenesis by engaging shiver-type movement or low-level movements, big movements that are of very high intensity, meaning they require a lot of effort, deploy a lot of adrenaline, epinephrine from our neurons, and signal particular types and amounts of fat thermogenesis, fat oxidation. Whereas low-level intensity exercise, low or moderate intensity exercise, walking, running, biking, where you can do that easily, there's not very much adrenaline release. So adrenaline, and aka epinephrine, is really the final common path by which movement of any kind, whether or not it's low-level shiver, or whether or not it's lifting a barbell, sprinting up a hill, or doing a long bike ride, adrenaline is the effector of fat loss. It's the trigger and it's the effector. So now I want to turn our attention to compounds that increase epinephrine and adrenaline, as well as compounds that work outside the adrenaline epinephrine pathway to increase the rates of fat loss. I almost always save compounds and supplements and things of that sort to the end, because I do believe that people should look first toward behavioral tools and an understanding of the science before they look toward a supplement or a particular thing that they can extract from diet. And at the time, I was reading about thermogenesis, and I learned about a compound that was actually discovered in the armory factories of World War II. And it was discovered because women in particular who were working in these factories would take a brush and dip it in a compound or a paint rather, and they would then paint the numbers with a stencil onto things like bombs and ammunition of various kinds. And they were losing weight like crazy. And it turns out that occasionally they'd lick the brush and then they would go back just to get a sharper point on the brush, and then they would paint onto these various bullets and missiles and so forth, bombs and so forth. And they started shedding all their body fat. And many of them lost a lot of weight, a significant portion of their weight, without changing anything else that they were doing, what they were eating, etc. Turned out that compound is something called dinitrophenol, DNP. And over the years, dinitrophenol, DNP, has gained popularity in some niche cultures, mainly bodybuilders, athletes, even in the kind of modeling industry. It is a absolutely terrible compound for anyone to use because it's highly fatal if your body temperature goes too high. Hyperthermia will kill you. And indeed, many people have died using dinitrophenol as a weight loss drug, or attempting to use it as a weight loss drug. But dinitrophenol really illustrates a principle, which is that your metabolism includes things like thyroid hormone and growth hormone, etc. But your body temperature and the way you utilize energy. And indeed, there's been a modern look into all this, and these numbers check out. That simply moving around a lot, even if those are subtle movements, greatly increases the amount of energy that you burn. And people who overeat, the people who can have the second or the third donut or donuts at all and don't seem to put on weight to the same degree, they are people that move around a lot even when seated. They're people that will often move their limbs very quickly as well. There even have been studies that have explored other things that correlate with fidgeters. Fidgeters stand up very quickly at the end of a lecture, or they start to gather their things very quickly, whereas non-fidgeters don't. So dogs like my bulldog Costello, definitely not a fidgeter. Every movement is incredibly slow and deliberate. Sitting down is a process. If you ask him to sit down, it's sort of a slow motion. You ask him to get up and he kind of looks at you, sighs, and then stands up. The fidgeters are the opposite of that, right? You say, "How are you doing?" And they go, "Great." So even sometimes their speech will be accelerated, although not always. But staccato movements, fidgeting, etc. And in 2015 and again in 2017, there have been studies that have explored this using some modern metabolic tracking. And indeed, simply moving a lot, being a fidgeter, bouncing your knee, standing up and pacing, several times or many times throughout the day led to considerable amounts of fat loss and weight loss when people were ingesting the same amount of food. If they overate, they were able to compensate and burn off that food. And if they were trying to lose weight and they incorporated this fidgeting protocol of deliberately trying to fidget more and move around during the day, pace, stand up more quickly, sit down and stand up more often rather, they found that they greatly increased their weight loss, anywhere from 20 to 30% increases. And it's also released from the so-called sympathetic nervous system, although that name is a bit of a misnomer because it has nothing to do with sympathy. It has to do with stimulating alertness and promoting action of the body. There's a big mistake in the literature that is finally being corrected among those who know. The mistake in the literature is that the adrenal glands and the release of adrenaline is what stimulates fat loss and fat oxidation. In fact, it was thought for a long time that adrenaline swimming around in your body of when you're fasted, because fasting can increase adrenaline, or when you're engaging in intense exercise, or when you're stressed, is going to promote fat oxidation. That's actually not the case. The adrenaline that stimulates fat oxidation, the burning of fat, is coming from neurons that actually connect to the fat, not hormones like adrenaline that are swimming around in your system. It's a local process. And this is very important because it means that what you do, the specific patterns of movements, and the specific environment you create that can stimulate these particular neurons to activate fat, meaning to release fat, to mobilize it, and then to burn it, is going to be a powerful lever that you can use in order to increase fat loss. And that's where it really gets interesting. Rothwell and Stock and others that they worked with subsequently found that these little fidgety movements, the engagement of certain aspects of our musculature that are nothing like exercise, it's not these large coordinated or rhythmic body movements, but rather subtle little bits of fidgety movement. And here I am doing a lot of fidgety movement as an example, tapping the pen, this kind of thing. I was probably that kid in class most of the time. I was like, I try not to do it to irritate people, but I was definitely a knee bouncer. I'm not particularly lean or not, but I was definitely, this is a common activity for me. People that do that sort of thing, it turns out that it's not the kind of caloric burn that we normally think of like, oh, you're running, lifting weights, swimming, yoga, etc. Those subtle movements of our core musculature, not just the core, but all our limbs and our musculature, those low-level movements, they trigger epinephrine release from these neurons, and they stimulate the mobilization of fat. And then that fat is oxidized at higher rates. And I find this fascinating. I wish more people knew about it, which is why I'm telling you about it today. This has nothing to do with exercise in the traditional form. And yet 800 to 2,500 calories per day, that's a considerable amount of fat oxidized. If you are in a calorie maintenance mode or if you're subcaloric, that's going to add to it still additional fat loss. The data on this are tremendous. I'll link to a few studies if you're really interested in learning about what's called NEAT, N-E-A-T, which is non-exercise activity thermogenesis, NEAT. So what's the protocol? Fidget. If you're really interested in burning calories and you already exercise, you want to burn more, or you don't have the opportunity to exercise, or you're averse to exercise for whatever reason, fidgeting movements, staccato movements, standing up, walking around, pacing, all the sort of nervous activities that we're so critical of in other people and sometimes in ourselves are actually mobilizing and oxidizing a lot of fat and a lot of energy. And while this probably won't compensate for chronic overeating, the caloric burn from this is considerable and very likely can offset a meal that had excessive calories or a kind of steady state of of eating too much. And it also starts to open up all sorts of thoughts and discussion about, when you travel, you tend to eat foods that are kind of outside your normal ones. We tend to eat, foods that aren't so great for us. We also tend to be a little bit more sedentary when we travel. We're on the plane, etc. But all of that aside, just the use of something like low-level movement, and it's almost like a tremor, but also these like short, small, fidgety movements. What they did was they took subjects who were hotel service people that would clean the hotels and come in and change the linens and so forth, divide them into two groups. One group, they were told, moving around and doing your duties for your job, meet the standards for U.S. guidelines for activity and movement, etc., and a basic lecture about how movement is good for you, etc., but mostly just that their daily activities met the standards for the U.S. The other group, however, was given a bunch of information about how movement and their daily routine was very good for cardiovascular health, it could be good for weight loss, etc. And then they tracked these subjects over a period of many weeks. The take-home message from this study was that simply being told that movement is good for you, can lead to weight loss, etc., led to significantly more body fat loss, waist to hip ratio changes in the direction that most people would want, essentially a slimming down, if you will, and all sorts of other positive effects on things like cardiovascular health, simply by the knowledge that movement and exercise can help various health markers. So this is remarkable, and it speaks to the power of the nervous system and the power of belief in governing aspects of our body and our physiology that one would otherwise think were outside our conscious control. Now, of course, any of you that think scientifically, which I imagine if you watch this podcast or listen to this podcast is all of you by now, probably thinking, well, maybe they just moved around more, or maybe they stood up and sat down more. Maybe they did something else that was different. And indeed, there's a strong possibility that they did things differently than the other group.